Welcome to Thornton webinar on the resilience in water and wastewater resources. By way of introduction, I'm Marizem, an audit executive at Thornton, and I will be the moderator for this session. I would like to introduce the panelists for this webinar. Mr. Manuel Sapiano, who's the CEO of the Energy and Water Agency within Malta's Ministry for Energy and Water Management. Also joining us on the panel is Dr. Kevin Gatt, who specializes in hydrology for environmental management and business administration. Engineer Marco Cremona, who's a hydrologist and water treatment engineer. I would like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists who accepted our invitation to participate in this webinar and to share their views on this interesting subject. I would also like to invite the audience to send any questions in the Q&A provided so that I can put forward your questions to our panelists. Our webinar will need to be shaped around one crucial concept, that is resilience, society's ability to withstand economic, social, and environmental shocks. Obviously, water has played and continues to play an important role within humanity. Health, food system, climate change, energy, finance are just some of the many areas which are impacted by water. I would like to begin by inviting Engineer Marco Cremona to give our audience a brief overview of how the Maltese water system stores and supplies water for domestic and commercial use.
Good afternoon. First of all, it's obvious that Malta is a very small country with a high population density. And traditionally, Malta has always had a relatively high population density. And this, of course, the more people, the more water required for everyday use and for food cultivation and any other economic process. Unfortunately, we also have a semi-arid climate, which means we don't get enough rain, and rain is the source of all fresh water. And we also have high evaporation rates, which means that the water we receive quickly evaporates and is lost. However, luckily, Malta has got an extensive groundwater system, natural groundwater system, which yields considerable amounts of fresh water. These groundwater systems, the main ones were discovered about 150 years ago, and they have been commercially exploited since the 1960s, initially by the precursor of the Water Service Corporation, which means the waterworks, which used to pump up this water to distribute it to the population. But increasingly, in the last 30, 40 years, even by private entities for various uses, by farmers, for irrigation, factories, bottling companies, anybody who finds it convenient and is generally a high consumer. In the mid-late 70s, Malta experienced a water supply crisis. At that time, the population was increasing, tourism had started, and so the demand for water increased. And the groundwater sources were not sufficient to meet the total national demand. And the country took a daring step in investing in what was a very new technology, which is reverse osmosis, which is a process which produces fresh water from seawater. And it has worked well. The issues with seawater reverse osmosis plants is, of course, that it consumes a lot of electricity. At present, what we get in our taps is a mix between reverse osmosis and groundwater, and the ratio is currently about 60% reverse osmosis and 40% groundwater. But the trend is towards increasing dependence on our water. The issue. Whereas most of the population is consuming tap water, unfortunately, there are wild sectors of the economy of the industry which still exploit groundwater and we are in a situation where the where there is a mismatch between what is going in to replenish the groundwater supplies, possibly also attributed to climate change, and what is being pumped up for our everyday uses, including car washes, landscaping, farming, whatever. I think by way of introduction, that's it.
Of course, water conservation is extremely important. Mr. Manuel Sapiano, how precarious is the situation with the supply of water in Malta?
So, good afternoon to all. And firstly, let's, to answer your question, let's make a difference. So, let's make a difference between natural water resources and water supplies. So, when we're looking at the supply of water, so the water we receive in our homes, one needs to say and one needs to highlight that Malta has enough production capacity to meet demand. And this comes because over the years, I would say over the last 40 years, Malta has invested in alternative water supplies. One can look at desalination, so reverse osmosis, but also one can look also at the recent introduction of reclaimed water, so wastewater which is treated up to a quality which can be used. So let's say that because of these investments, Malta has and is managing to meet demand. And in fact, when we look at investments which are being done, works which are being done right now, the water utility, so Water Services Corporation, is looking at keeping ahead and increasing its production capacity to meet the project demands up to 2050. So building a plant, building a production plant needs years. It doesn't come from one day to another. And therefore, these production projections, these demand projections needs to be taken into the long term. And therefore, when one look at let's say the situation, and when one look at the capacity we have to meet demand, given our scarce natural resource base, I think it is important to highlight the positives of water management in Malta. In particular, we mentioned desalination and the success made by water services to reduce the energy demand for desalination. So almost by like from requiring 10 units to produce one cubic meter of water, going down to slightly over 3. And that's a very important result. One can look at the new water program, so water reuse, another important step. And one can also look at leakage management, so trying to reduce water flowing out of distribution pipes, where, for example, our national demand today is much lower than it was 20 years ago. Not because we're using less water, but because we're losing less water. And therefore, yes, water supply is always a challenge. It's always a challenge because we've got a low natural resource base, but it doesn't mean that we are, let's call it, in an extreme situation from the point of view of supply. And this is because over the years, as I said, there's been significant investment to plan for the situations which we are facing.
Thanks for this, Mr. Manuel Sapiano. So similarly to other diseases, some of the measures recommended by the health authorities to combat COVID-19 include hand washing, hygiene, and basic sanitation. Mr. Manuel Sapiano, did COVID-19 affect the demand for water?
So what we've experienced with COVID is a shift in activities. Firstly, the number of people working from home increased. And this means that the time spent at home increased, therefore the water use at home increased, but it reduced on another side. So whereas one would wash his hand, one would go to the bathroom at work, that was being done at home. So there was this shift between sectors. One looks, and there was a lot of, let's say, highlight on the recommendations by the health authorities to sing a song whilst washing your hands, and yes, that increases use, but washing hands is not the major use of water in the home. So compared to toilet flushing, compared to showering, that is a minor use. So therefore, let's say the consumption patterns don't indicate that the health recommendations, the way of washing your hands in a more health friendly way, affected significantly demand. Possibly, however, one of the main issues, which was not noticed just in Malta, but also in other European countries, was that spending more time at home leads you to do more activities at home, which usually you don't do, to try also to fill time. So increasing the number of times you wash your car, more possibly growing plants, and therefore more, it's positive because it's, let's say we're creating a more greener environment, but that needs more water too. So yeah, COVID created a new reality in a number of different instances, a number of different conditions, but also in water. But in water, we're not looking at that increase in demand, but more a shift in demand, and also these how to address personal water use so as to limit and to try to be more efficient when you're doing these increased activities at home.
Thanks for this. So in certain countries, samples of wastewater have been collected from the water network to trace remnants of genetic material from COVID-19. This information can be proved to be useful to help identify to what extent is the COVID-19 present in the population. In your opinion, Mr. Manuel Sappiano, what are the implications of COVID-19 on wastewater in Malta?
Okay, so just a small clarification on this. So genetic material from COVID-19 was detected in wastewater in a number of countries, and it was being used as an indicator to show where COVID was present in the population. Not only not in Malta, but not even in any other country in Europe were there any infections of COVID-19 attributed to wastewater. I think that's something which is important to clarify, and therefore wastewater per se has not been in any case a carrier of the virus. Also because wastewater treatment, first of all, is waste conveyance and also treatment is quite secluded, and also the process itself involves disinfection steps, and disinfection is known to destroy particularly this, let's say this virus is particularly vulnerable to disinfection and to disinfectants. So therefore, whilst this aspect of using these COVID signatures as an early warning system for the presence of the virus is a very interesting aspect of using wastewater, it is very important that wastewater itself, let's say the discharge of wastewater to coastal waters, or also the use of wastewater, in no way can be, let's say, if practiced correctly, if practiced with disinfection, in no way can be a dangerous source of the virus itself. So therefore, I wouldn't see so much an impact on wastewater itself coming from these conditions.
Thanks for this insight, Mr. Manuel Sappiano. So in response to COVID-19 pandemic, it's imperative to maintain sustainability of water infrastructure as it increases resilience to climate, health, and food system shocks. Dr. Kevin Gatt, how can water infrastructure enhance sustainability?
Well, I join with my colleagues in wishing a good afternoon to our audience. I think you have touched on a number of critical words that we need to clarify and understand in order to determine the way forward in sustaining not only our water infrastructure, but more importantly, our water resource. First of all, the concept of sustainability is often confused with physical development. The terminology sustainable development is unfortunately associated with development in its physical form. But sustainability, really and truly, is about all forms of development. Another misconception is that sustainability or sustainable development is an environmental issue. In fact, sustainability is more than an environmental issue. It is a holistic approach to decision making, in which it is important that we maximize our economic, social, and environmental goals. Sustainability revolves on these three pillars, and unless we manage to maximize all three, our end result can never be really and truly sustainable. You also mentioned the concept of resilience, and as you rightly pointed out, an appropriate definition is the ability to withstand economic, social, and environmental shocks. Once again, we see these three same parameters of sustainability reflected in resilience. And if resilience was ever seriously tested, COVID-19 was the true and most recent test that we have experienced. Truth of the matter is that the environment was the only winner. We have seen improvements in air quality. We have seen a decrease in the demand for water and therefore on the extraction of groundwater, which are all evidence of anthropogenic effects. That means they are a consequence of man-made behaviors. And the weakness in resilience was particularly evident in our socio-economic model. And when I say our, it is not just the Maltese socio-economic model, but it is also the global socio-economic model. We have seen economies facing extreme difficulties. We have seen the threats of business collapse. We have seen the number of deaths around the world. And obviously, there is an issue with resilience. So it is important that we frame our future, what is being defined as the new normal, on the true concepts of sustainable development and resilience. Let us not forget that climate change is also the result of anthropogenic, that means man-made effects. In terms of water resources, climate change will bring more periods of drought. That means that we will not have sufficient rainfall for recharge purposes, for storage purposes, and therefore our natural water systems will be put more under stress. We are also expected to experience more intense storms. That means that we will have significant quantities of rain falling in short periods. This means that they will saturate those pervious areas more quickly, and therefore we will have less water recharging to our groundwater aquifers. And that means that our groundwater aquifers will be net losers. Climate change also envisages sea level rise. And because we have a mean sea level aquifer which floats on a seawater aquifer, changes in sea level rise are likely also to decrease the volume of groundwater that can be stored. So from climate change perspective, we are seeing these threats which should motivate us to adopt a more water-centric approach that includes both the decrease in water use, the amplification of rainwater harvesting, the conservation of water, and a circular approach also to water management. You also mentioned the issue of health. Well-being is becoming a subject which is high on our agenda. We know about respiratory diseases in urban environments because of the activities that go on in these environments. We have seen during COVID that we have started to appreciate and cherish more the need for leisure and recreation, which calls for such facilities to be close to urban areas so that they can be easily accessible and enjoyed without having to travel significant distances in order to enjoy ourselves. So another aspect which perhaps came into play because of the closure of ports and airports was, do we have sufficient food security? Now, obviously, food is directly related to water consumption. In order to grow food, in order to grow crops, we need a certain amount of water. Now, our island is a small island. We have seen the amount of cultivated land coming under pressure as farmers seek better employment opportunities, better economic opportunities. But we need to stem this hemorrhage. We need to look at new forms of cultivation. For example, vertical farms, which can intensify the use of our land in terms of the production per square meter, but we also need to plan the right crops so as to ensure that we cultivate crops with low water demand, which can be complementary to the available resource we have done. If we had to look at water infrastructure, the Water Services Corporation, in my humble opinion, has done a fantastic job in water production. We have no issue regarding water production. In sewage treatment, we have baiting beaches, which certify the work that is being done in this respect. And now it has embarked also on the new water project, a circular approach to the treatment of water, whereby treated sewage effluent is being treated to such a high degree that it can be used as a substitute for groundwater for non-potable use in industry and agriculture. But we cannot rely on the sterling efforts of the Water Services Corporation for sustainability. Sustainability is something that everyone needs to join in and contribute, because it is not a one-horse race, but it is the cumulative effect of the entire community. Let us not forget that although we do not have a problem in terms of the production of water because of desalination technology, we are still under obligation under the Water Framework Directive to protect our freshwater body, that is our groundwater, both in terms of its budget, that means not to extract more than its sustainable yield, as well as in its quality. And therefore, we need a new type of infrastructure. We need green and blue infrastructure, which is an infrastructure based on mimicking nature in order to redress the environmental damage that physical and other forms of development can cause. And this leads us to a mantra, to a mindset of water-centric developments. We have a large building stock, and we need to encourage the retrofitting of buildings for water efficiency. Malta's water catchment management plan already provides for such incentives to be available, but we need uptake. We cannot anymore say we don't have a water production problem, but we have to understand that we have a freshwater resource problem. The water catchment management plan also wants to explore the use of reverse osmosis technology inland, whereby the brine reject, which is the waste from the desalination process, can be pumped back to the seawater aquifer so that it does not cause salinization of the freshwater aquifer, in order to encourage larger buildings towards the central part of the island to be independent of groundwater. We also have an agricultural policy that is sensitive to water demand, an agricultural policy which encourages the use of drought-tolerant crops, the use of crops which are staple, but at the same time do not exert a huge demand, as we are witnessing today with what is being cultivated. So, yes, we need to mimic nature and take this ecosystems approach. This is a business opportunity. This is not an anchor to economic development. This is a new business niche that we need to capitalize upon, that we need the business sector to capitalize upon and make a showcase of it as part of Malta's competitiveness. The economy as we know it today is an evolving economy. Today's economy is going to be a decarbonized, circular and green economy. The European Green Deal makes it clear in which direction the European Union wants to move. And as a member state of the European Union, we need to work towards technologies which are decarbonized, and that is why it is important not to depend on desalination technology, because desalination has a higher carbon footprint than normal water resources, a circular, such as the case of new water, but we can also adopt these principles by treating grey water and black water in larger buildings, and a greener economy, whereby we reintroduce nature into our built environment. We need the fiscal incentives to make the transition, to make this investment worth its while. We need to ensure that there is a level playing field for all water-centric technology and for all water-centric initiatives. And one has to be brave and look at the existing water tariffs to see whether they could contribute, or their restructuring could contribute to level the playing field between water-centric technologies, water-centric initiatives, and traditional initiatives.
Thanks, Dr. Gad. Very, very interesting. So COVID-19 has affected every sector of the global economy, and the hotel industry is among those which were affected the worst. How did COVID-19 affect various industries, such as that of hospitality in terms of water? Engineer Marco Cremona.
Yes, definitely. The hospitality sector was the worst hit for obvious reasons. I mean, almost immediately, when the airport closed down, no longer any tourists were coming, and Malta was getting used to getting close to 2 billion tourists a year. And even the timing was quite unfortunate in the sense that, the industry was gearing up towards late spring and of course summer, when the occupancy levels in hotels are at their highest. Suffice to say, when it comes to water, the fact that you've got no tourists, of course, the hotels were closed down. The only water-related operations in hotels which closed down was, if hotels had some landscaping, of course, that has to continue, because otherwise, everything will die. Some water used in maintenance, some water used in testing firefighting devices and this kind of thing. But really and truly, the consumption was minimal. If we consider that in normal operations, a typical 4-star hotel uses 300. A guest in a hotel uses about 300 liters per guest night. And with running at around 2 million tourists, the consumption by hotels is huge. Now we also have to look at where hotels get their water from. And the situation in Malta is that over a number of years, the large hotels near the coast have invested in their own desalination units, their own reverse osmosis units. So really and truly, this drastic reduction in demand will not have impacted on the demand, on the supply of the Water Service Corporation, because they were getting their water, they usually get their water from somewhere else. Even when it comes to smaller hotels, a lot of them get their water supplies by Bowser, which is essentially groundwater being transported by water tanker. So despite the drastic impact on the hospitality sector, it might not be the case that the impact was so much reflected in the supply systems of the Water Service Corporation. Of course, from a groundwater, from a water resource point of view, this was extremely positive. That this volume of water, which is used normally, which is considerable, has completely vanished. That is positive for the natural system. There are also ancillary services which come with hospitality industry. It's not just hotels. For example, commercial laundries. You know, most hotels do not wash their linen, their towels, but that is subcontracted to commercial laundries. And most commercial laundries get their water from groundwater, not from the Water Service Corporation. There was also an impact, which I found to be somewhat strange, in the bottling production, in water production. Mainly because a lot of suppliers also supply bottled water to offices and factories, and especially in these 19-liter returnable. So the fact that the workforce was reduced and was less, there was an impact on that sector as well. People were using their cars less. So I'm not sure whether the impact, whether they were washing their cars as frequently as they did. So there might have been a reduction also in the consumption by car washes. Gyms, of course, when you go to the gym, you normally shower. The fact that gyms were closed, possibly that led in an overall, people would have showered more regularly at home, but probably the impact is overall positive in the sense that the demand was decreased. Kevin touched on the point of food security and food production. And I remember in the first days of COVID, people running to supermarkets, stocking all goods available on the shelves, whether they're foodstuffs or whether they're detergents or you name it. And this might have might have given an impetus to local farmers to increase production, because they might have anticipated that, if something happens with the ferries and the imports, there would be a greater demand, and therefore they would fetch a better price for their products. I don't know whether that happened. I don't have data on this, but certainly there was some discussion about Malta increasing its food production in future, which of course has to be taken in consideration of the limited freshwater resources on the island.
Thanks for this, Engineer Marco Cremona. So due to COVID-19, companies from various industries may perhaps refrain from incurring capital expenditure for water solution to conserve cash. Engineer Marco Cremona, what is the effect of this in general on companies providing water equipment and technologies?
I think the investment in water infrastructure in the private sector, I think, is low for a number of reasons. First of all, like I mentioned, a lot of commercial entities do not get their water from the Water Service Corporation. They get their water supplies from private boreholes, for which they do not pay a price. So if you consider the activities, the expenses incurred by, let's say, a factory, even a factory using lots of water, the proportion of costs allocated to water, the cost of water, is a fraction of what they use, for example, in electricity. So the incentive to invest in electricity saving devices or renewable energy or whatever is definitely much higher than an investment in water conservation or water recycling. And I think this is a general problem, not associated with COVID. Possibly one effect which might have happened is that the fact that people were living more in their homes, people who were found themselves unemployed or underemployed were living in their home. They consumed more water at home. But and definitely that would have reflected in a higher water and electricity bill. That might, if people looked at their water and electricity consumption over the last few months, they would probably have noticed an increase, which might be drastic or might be mild. But that might have had an impact on people to start to increase awareness about water consumption patterns at home.
Thanks for this. So this brings me to the next question about water safety and security. Mr. Manuel Sapiano, how can one strengthen water security and reliability of water supply from both business and domestic sector perspective?
So let's look at the domestic and the commercial sector together. So discussing security of supply, I would say that we have to look at not just the quantity, so that you have water available flowing every day, but also the quality of the water. If anything, the COVID situation has shown the resilience of our water supply system. If we look at the months, let's say the months where COVID was much more pronounced than today, WSC managed to maintain a safe supply of water. And looking back at those weeks, the main concerns, I would say, were not the volume, was not the water itself, but the management systems. In fact, when preparing for COVID, one of the main measures undertaken by water services was actually the management of the people working in the water sector, because you need people to manage the system, manage the network, manage production, and those people are key persons to maintain the system going. So one of the aspects which was really tackled with, I would say, minute detail was the remote management of production sites and distribution sites, and the duplication of these management systems, so that if there's a failure, if there's an infection in one of, let's say, in one of the plants, there would have been someone in another place, isolated, who could have taken up the management of a particular point, actually from home. Another aspect which was increasingly considered was also disinfection. And disinfection from the point of view of ensuring that even if there's an accidental contamination, the water contains sufficient disinfectant to ensure that water supply is safe and is never doubted to be safe. So one thing which I take from the COVID situation is the need, if anything, to keep upgrading remote or IT control of water systems. So the need for modernization and the need to keep up front of technology, and in particular to reduce as much as possible, let's say, the human contact between the water system and the operator of the water system. So this is an area where I believe the sector will develop in the future. So the remote management systems, the upgrading of distribution also, let's say, the integration of IT systems in distribution, and which would enable a more remotely managed system. So therefore, let's say, from a security of supply point of view, yes, we've got the traditional system, but we need to ensure its resilience, and therefore, its resilience in one way or another can be ensured from what we've seen in with this experience, in trying to, as much as possible, going and pushing forward as advanced management systems as possible.
Thanks for this. So Water Be the Change is a national conservation campaign which was launched in September 2019. Mr. Manuel Sapiano, what is the aim of this campaign, and can you provide us with the context of it, please?
Sure. We've been talking a lot on water production systems, but apart from production, one needs to look also at how water is used, so water demand. And let's say in this campaign, which is managed by the agency, we've tried as much as possible to put the spotlight on the individual, where basically, if we're talking about water use, each and everyone's role matters. So it's the way I use water personally. And It's putting once more the spotlight on what I do instead of what should be done. In fact, to undertake most of the water saving measures in home, you don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be called an expert to actually do them. These are simple things, and simple things which each of us can do, like closing a tap when it is not needed to be running, like paying a bit of attention when buying appliances, when buying water use points. So very simple things which if one knows about them, it's much easier to implement, and therefore the role, let's say the scope of this campaign is actually to put the spotlight on what each and every one of us can do, obviously at home, but also at work, at leisure, and in all our activities which we do. Actually, yes, what I do at home, so my small contribution alone, will not address Malta's, let's say, water challenges, but the small contribution of 500,000 people, added all together, goes a long way to address part of that problem and part of the challenge. And therefore, addressing water demand together and addressing our water use together is a very important aspect, which, let's say, implemented in parallel with actions like, let's say, the more infrastructural measures which are implemented at a public utility, at a water services level. These two things go hand in hand in addressing, let's say, our national challenge in the water sector. In fact, if we look at the very high policy statement which comes out of Malta's water catchment management plan, is that Malta's water challenge can be addressed through the joint implementation of water demand management and water supply augmentation measures. So we need to broaden our resource base, we need to invest and to create more sustainable water production sources, but we also need to ensure that we are using that water in as efficient a way as possible, and therefore these two measures, let's say, broad measures, go together and are an important step in addressing this important challenge, which is tied, after all, to our lives and our sustainability.
Thanks for this. So to conclude our discussion today, I would like to invite our panelists to summarize into a few points their discussion. So shall we start from you, Engineer Marco Cremona? Thank you.
I think what COVID did was it shocked us and it exposed certain vulnerabilities. It impacted on things we take for granted, like going to work or meeting people. One resource we definitely take for granted is water. So I think that the message which should come across is that, I mean, we are taking water for granted. We shouldn't, because like I mentioned earlier, you know, this country doesn't have abundant resources of fresh water, which we can waste or use for frivolous matters. And this imparts a program of information. I mean, one event which I saw happening during COVID was that a number of local councils decided to take it upon themselves to power wash streets and parks and whatever, because of the fear of infection from, I don't know, viruses in the street or whatever. And I think that exposed the lack of awareness of the issues facing water scarcity in Malta. I think another point that we should take from this experience is that the country needs to have contingency plans in place, not necessarily for a COVID-related pandemic, but Malta is, and I think this is a problem. Malta is moving towards increasing maybe full dependency on reverse osmosis production for its water. And as much as I appreciate the technology. Indeed, I operate reverse osmosis plants in the private sector. The technology itself has got vulnerabilities. You could have issues of oil spills, which could stop the production of water from the sea. You could have a prolonged electricity cut. So moving towards increasing full dependency on reverse osmosis for our freshwater supplies, I think it's a problem, and maybe COVID would expedite matters in Malta having robust contingency plans for other natural or man-made disasters.
Dr. Kevin Gatt.
In order to conclude, I think what we should be taking home is that as COVID showed us that, or quantified to a certain extent, the impact of human beings on the environment, we now need a new normal which is more water-centric. That means that in all we do, we have to take into account the impact that our activities have on water resources and to mitigate against excessive consumption and increased circularity. One of the sectors which can make a difference is the urban development sector. Buildings need to become more water-centric. Urban spaces need to be designed with green and blue infrastructure to create microclimates that promote well-being for the community that they serve. Shortly, we will witness 3 green and blue infrastructure projects which government has announced in Mosta, Hamrun and Ormi. Let these be an example to take forward to our urban spaces and to our buildings. And therefore, I think it is time also for building regulations and for design guidelines to be updated in order to ensure that all forms of physical development are water-centric and are as resilient to water resources or contribute towards the resilience of water resources as much as possible. To join with my colleague Manuel, I truly believe that by doing this, we can truly be the change.
Mr. Manuel Sapiano.
What's important to note and for everyone to take, let's say, a good consideration of is that there's a lot which is done to ensure that we have waters in our homes, in our workplaces. So it's not just what's being done today to actually produce water, to actually distribute water, but also the planning which is done to ensure that the same conditions, so the same security of supply is maintained over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And that planning occurs now. In fact, if we look at let's say the planning mantra right now in the water sector, particularly in the Malta water sector, we've seen, possibly some of us would have seen and would have referred to the reformulation of the public utilities, or the reformulation of water services into a net zero impact water utility, which means that the water utility is working to give back to the water environment as much water as it takes up. This can be either through intended or unintended recharge, so the return back of water to the environment, but also the substitution of supply with alternative water resources. And therefore, these new operating structures, these new thoughts, these new management frameworks, which are important to ensure this broad concept of sustainability in how we use water, are important. However, once more, let's say my closing message would be that yes, water is a national challenge. It is not just a challenge for the public sector, it's not just a challenge for water services or for government, but it's a challenge which, if we need to ensure sustainability in the sector, it's something which we need to work together. And once more, the message from the campaign is that that small contribution which I can make counts, because basically that small reduction in water use, that small reduction which I can do every day, is a very important component of what can be achieved nationally if we want to increasingly move towards sustainable use of water and also the protection of water in our natural environment.
So this brings us to the end of our session. Many thanks to our panelists for their insights and for such an interesting discussion. I would like to thank also the audience for watching us. I hope you enjoyed this session and I invite you to join us for next week's set of webinars. Thanks.